Everybody hear me okay? We're going to wake everybody up now. You got a half an hour. Got to deal with me for a half an hour. So I'm going to talk a little bit about surviving government audits. So how many of you have already gone through a government audit? A few of you. How many of you want to go through a government audit? Not many more. All right, so let's talk a little bit about government audits. So we're going to talk a little bit about helping you to understand the audit process. What are regulators focused on? And this is going to be based upon how you get funded. So how you get funded is really going to dictate what regulators are looking at. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the government audits that have taken place and what type of stuff they have found. And then some resources available, some things that you guys should be doing now to prepare for the government audits. Because it's not a matter of if you're going to be getting audited by the government, it's when you get audited. If you are getting government funding, there's a high likelihood you're going to get audited. So why does the government perform audits? Well, first, to ensure compliance with rules and regulations. They set up rules, they set up regulations, and they want to make sure that organizations are following those rules and regulations. Also, to ensure quality of service and reporting. There's information that's coming into the government, and they want to make sure that information is complete and accurate. So they go in and they do audits to ensure that the information is accurate. They're looking to see that you're providing quality service to the consumers. Because remember, very different from other places where you do business. If I provide a service to you, you can evaluate that service that I provide to you, and you can determine, did I do a good job? Did I not do a good job? And if I did a good job, you pay me. If I didn't do a good job, you hold back on my check. In the case of nonprofits where you're doing services for an individual and the government's paying you, the government doesn't always have the ability to see the services that you provided and determine if those services are quality services. So part of the reason they do these audits is to check to see the quality of the service that's being provided. To ensure funding streams are properly monitoring their providers. If you think about it, the state controller's office is mandated to go in and look at various funding sources. And they're looking at different governmental agencies. And when they go in and they do these audits of the various governmental agencies, they go through and determine, are the governmental agencies doing an effective job, not just of managing their resources, but also managing the resources that are being pushed down to providers. And there have been many instances where there have been OSC audits, State Controller's Office audits, where the State Controller's Office said, hey, wait a minute, the funding source, let's take New York State Education Department for an example, is not doing an effective job of monitoring the agencies that they're supposed to be overseeing. And because of that, there was legislation that was passed 4 years ago that required every single preschool special education provider to be audited. And that came out of the state legislation. And that was because the funding sources weren't doing an effective job. So that gives rise to audits. And finally, probably the most important reason is they want money. You know, think about it, when OPWD raised their rates, what was it, about 4 or 5 years ago? You know, they didn't want to raise the rates as high as they did. And they came back and said, okay, we'll give you guys a little bit more because we're going to institute a stronger audit procedure and we're going to take back money, so we're going to recoup the difference anyway. So, you know, the reality of the situation is that, you know, a big chunk of the reason why these audits take place is really just to recoup funds. So what triggers an audit? Why do you have an audit? Well, again, as I said before, it could be mandated by government regulation in the case of the State Education Department. Could be self-reported if you have a lot of instances where you're self-reporting issues. You know, after a while, you're reporting, I made a mistake, I made a mistake, I made a mistake, I made a mistake. You know, the government says, hey, wait a minute, they're making a lot of mistakes. Let me go in and check out to see what they're doing. Or could be a whistleblower. Part of the fun part about Medicaid regulations, I always love this about Medicaid regulations, is part of your job as a nonprofit organization is to educate your employees and staff and people you work with regarding Medicaid compliance, and that if you're not in compliance, it's their job to report it. Oh, and by the way, if you report us and the government recoups funds based upon you reporting us, you get a percentage of that. The KETAM rules. So it's funny because you're sitting out there and you're educating your staff on how to turn you in essence, and if you have a disgruntled employee, they could get money off it. Late filed cost reports. If you can't get your cost reports in on time, that's probably indicative of a problem that's occurring within your organization. So that could be a triggering factor. Inconsistencies in reporting. So if you're filing your cost reports or doing filing vouchers or something and you're constantly making mistakes, or there's inconsistencies in the information. Again, these are all triggering factors. Think about it. When you think about an audit is based on risk. So if the government feels that there's a higher level of risk, what are they going to do? They're going to look at you. Poor monitoring by funders. We kind of talked about that in the SED world, but also they had a similar circumstance in the OSS world, where OSS wasn't doing a good job of ensuring that depreciation, which is a non-allowable cost for certain programs, was left off. So they came in and they started looking at OSS-based programs to see that the depreciation was being handled correctly. Is it something I said? Let's just check. Level and type of funding is another thing that they look at. So if you get a lot of funding and they're seeing issues within that funding, or it's a new funding stream, or it's a funding stream where they've had problems in the past, that could trigger an audit. When was the last time you were audited? I mean, if you haven't been audited in a long time, it could just be your time to get audited. Programmatic compliance. So if you have a lot of issues in your programmatic compliance, that could trigger an audit. So let's say you have a program audit that comes in and they look at your program side and they see that you're making mistakes. They could report it to the fiscal side to have the fiscal people come in also. Justice Center incidents. I know that OASAS and some of the other funders have said if there are a high level of reporting in the Justice Center, that could be indicative of underlying problems within the agency, and that could trigger an audit. And finally, just the luck of the draw. You know, you open up that Wonka bar and there's that golden ticket. So important concepts to think about in terms of an audit. So what is an audit? Well, audits are based on risk. So when the auditors come in, they're looking at the risk, and there's two types of risk. There's inherent risk and control risk. So an inherent risk is a risk that's associated with large dollar items. It's more judgmental, and a control risk is that there's control problems within your environment. So when auditors typically come in, one of the first things they'll do is they'll do a risk assessment. They'll take a look at how you're doing business. They'll gain an understanding of whether your operations and controls are effective. They'll look at some of the other external factors, issues that they found in other audits that they've done for other agencies, and they'll incorporate that all into the strategy that they're going to use in terms of auditing your agency. So one of the things that you should be doing as an agency up front is you should be stalking the audits that are being done by other, that were being done by the agencies that fund you, of other agencies that are similar to yours. So if you're a state education department funded agency, you want to go looking at the OSC audits and see what's going on in the OSC audits. If you get Medicaid funding, go back and look at the OMIG audits and look at maybe the OPWD or OASIS audits that have been issued, and see what sort of findings they're having in the programs that you guys operate to see if you have similar problems. And I would go back then and use that almost like a checklist to say, this is what they're looking at. Do I have similar problems within my agency that I should be worried about? Audits are often black and white. When they come in, they do their audits, are you compliant or are you not compliant? There is no shade of gray. Oh, I got most of it right. I did 90% of it right, so therefore give me 90% of the funding. No. If I made a mistake, I don't get paid for that claim. I'll give you for instance. We had a client that there was a log note for a physical therapist. This was an early intervention. And there was a log note for the physical therapist, and it said on top of it, physical therapy log note, name of physical therapist. It was listed there. The log note was there, and it outlined the physical therapy issues. And on the bottom, the physical therapist signed it, but never put in the fact that they were a physical therapist. They didn't put their credentials after their name. And that's one of the requirements in early intervention, to have that credential there. So the government funding source disallowed that claim because the credential wasn't there, even though it was obvious that it was a physical therapy service. So you could provide the best service in the world, but if you're not documenting it appropriately, you're not going to get funded for it. And again, lack of compliance results in recoveries. That's where they come and take the money back. Perception is important. When you do an audit, think about it a second. If you're an auditor and you walk into an environment and there's a good control environment, You talk to the executive director and staff, and they're very, very knowledgeable, and they understand what's going on within the program, and they can talk intelligently about the program. They understand the business. They understand the industry. They can turn around information quickly. So you ask them for information. You say, I need it by tomorrow. And by tomorrow, it's sitting there waiting for you. Invoices and everything else. You pull out files to review, and all the files look exactly the same, and they're neat and orderly, and everything's labeled. And you read through the board minutes, and they're effective board minutes, and it's well laid out, and the board is really having these deep conversations about governance issues. As an auditor, how do you feel about that organization? Come on, auditors. How do you feel about it? Awesome, right. You feel awesome. All right. So if you're not doing those things, and you come in, and you know, we just finished auditing an agency where we went in and we're flipping through case files, and we're finding other individuals' notes in the case files for one. So it's one individual, and somebody else's case notes are in that file, and things are missing, and things don't add up, and it's a mess, and we're spending time. How do we feel about that organization? Not good at all. So, you know, the point is, where is the auditor going to dig deeper? In the organization that's very clean and organized, or in the organization that's messy? So the point is, keep your files neat and clean, make sure you got things orderly, because perception is extremely important in the world of auditing. Perception is reality. So kind of keep that in mind. Documentation is paramount. I've heard so many auditors say to me, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. How do I know it actually occurred? I'm telling you it did. Your word means nothing to me. It has to be documented. So you have to make sure that everything is documented. Make sure you have the backup support. Make sure you have the invoices. If it isn't documented, it didn't occur. And you need to be compliant with regulations. Regulations change on a regular basis. How many of you get listservs that are keeping track of what's happening within the funding streams where you get paid? Nobody? A couple. I mean, you really should be in a situation where you're getting regular communication. Join trade associations that deal with your funding streams. Go onto the funding stream websites on a regular basis and see what's happening. Get on their listservs to get information about changes in regulations. Again, I've seen audits that have taken place where they focus in on the period where regulations changed to see if you changed in time. And we've had situations where, you know, 90% of the staff changed due to the regulation, but somebody was out sick when the regulation change occurred and they weren't aware of it. And, you know, for a period of several weeks before they got on track, all of their claims were denied because they were using an old form or they weren't following the newest regulation. So just make sure you keep track on that. So I'm going to ask you a question. How many of you receive cost-based funding, which basically is a deficit-funded contract? You get paid based on the expenditures you incur. It's a bunch of you. How many of you get fee-based funding, where you get paid a fee for service for providing a service? So a few of you. How many of you get performance-based contracts, where you get paid based upon performance? So a couple there too. So each one of those types of funding is going to have a different way that the government is going to audit you. So think about it. If you're cost-based reimbursed, what does the government care about? Your costs. So they're going to focus their time and attention on the expenditures that you have as an organization. So it's an expenditure-driven audit. So do you have proper support for the expenditures? So do you have invoices? Can you prove you went out to bid and are following normal purchasing practice? Do you have quotes? Do you have proof of service? Do you have proof of delivery? Those are the types of things they're looking at. Are you aware of what's allowable and non-allowable costs? Every agency will outline what's allowable and what's not allowable. If you get funded by State Education Department, Office of Alcohol and Substance Abuse Services, Office of Mental Health, or Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, then your CFR manual is going to, they just keep leaving. The CFR manual is what's going to dictate your funding. So when you look at that, if you look at Appendix X within the CFR, it goes on for 3 or 4 pages of what's a non-allowable cost. So what you want to do is you want to familiarize yourself with those non-allowable costs, and you want your staff who are involved in coding things in the general ledger and ordering stuff to understand what those allowable and non-allowable costs are too. Are costs being allocated appropriately between entities and between programs? When auditors come in, they spend a lot of time and energy looking at allocation methodologies, especially if you have related party transactions. I can tell you I've seen so many organizations. You too? Okay. I've seen so many organizations that they do a really, really good job within the program of determining what's allowable and what's not. And then they have a parent organization that allocates costs down, and no one's paying attention to the costs that are being allocated by the parent. So you have costs that are non-allowable at the parent level. It could be a vehicle of an officer, it could be gifts, it could be fundraising costs. I've seen that happen, where those are all up at the parent level and those all get allocated down, and those are going to be disallowed upon audit. So you really have to pay attention, not just what's happening within the funding streams that you have, but also if you have related parties that are charging costs over. They're also looking at duplication of efforts. So again, if I have an executive director at the program level or at the agency level, and then I have a parent up here that also has a CEO, and some of that cost is being allocated down, why do I need an executive director at the program level and then also a CEO at the agency level? And there might be a valid reason, but you better be able to explain that to the auditors, because those are the types of things that the auditors are looking at and saying, hey, wait a minute, there's duplication of effort here. Why do I need to have that? And why should I be paying for duplication of effort? I don't want to pay for inefficiencies. Same thing with staffing patterns. Are your staffing patterns appropriate? Or are they not appropriate? Because if they feel that your staffing patterns are excessive, they're not going to fund you for it. And then how are you handling related party transactions? Most funding streams, especially any ones that file a cost report, whether it be Medicaid, state ed, CFR, any of them, they put limitations on the costs that a related party can charge. You're limited to the lower of fair market value of that service or the actual cost of the related party. So make sure that there's no built-in profitability in what you're charging, because again, that's going to be disallowed. Any questions on any of those things? What about fee-based? So if cost-based is going to be based upon the cost that you incur, what is fee-based going to be based on? What are they really focusing on from a fee-based perspective? Don't look, just say. They're focused on compliance. They want to make sure that you're following the rules and regulations. Because remember, in a fee-based environment, you get paid. She did come back. She didn't lie to us. On a fee-based case, you're in a situation where the cost doesn't matter because you're getting paid the same fee regardless of what your costs are. So really the concern under a fee base is making sure that you've provided the service that you said you were going to provide, and that that service is documented and matches out to what it's supposed to. So again, compliance driven. How many of you have a quality assurance function in place to be looking at the fee-based services? So a bunch of you do. You should really have a quality assurance function in place to be doing at least some level of testing of those fee-based services to make sure that those fee-based services are appropriately documented and you're following the regulations. We'll talk about some of those regulations a little later. We've given within the presentation a whole bunch of different regulations based upon the different funding streams. All of the funding streams have out there regulations. You can use those as your, in essence, an audit guide and give them to your quality assurance staff or give them to your internal audit staff to go through and really look at these and make sure that you're staying in compliance with the programs that you have. Again, the funders have published guidelines. Use them. Use the guidelines. They're telling you what they want. They're telling you what should be in the files. If you're not paying attention to what they're telling you, then you have to live with the consequences of it. Important that you mentioned to change and monitor changes in regulations and stalk reports. I think it's very, very important to stalk the reports that are being issued by governmental agencies. It's extremely important because that's where you get some really good insight into what's happening and what they're looking at. And it changes over time. What they're looking at today may not be what they're looking at tomorrow. So just make sure that you spend the time focusing on a regular basis. On performance-based, they're looking at or focusing on your tracking mechanisms. How are you ensuring that you're meeting the parameters that you said? So if you said that 90% of all people, all the consumers you're working with have met this parameter, how can you support that? What's your proof? And that's what they're looking at. So on the performance-based contracts, they're really looking at how can you substantiate the claims that you're making in terms of meeting expectations. And then also, how are you defining the thresholds? So if there are certain thresholds that you have to meet, how are those thresholds being defined, and how do they match out to the contract that you've entered into? Any questions on any of that stuff? You're allowed to ask questions. Go ahead. You're not allowed to ask questions. They are. Oh, no. False alarm. So some preventative strategies. There are a lot of people who have hit the beaches and taken the sword before you. Take the time to learn from what other people have done. Again, going back and looking at those reports. There's a lot of information out there. Other people have gotten hit with large disallowances, whether it be cost-based or compliance-based. Go back and take a look at some of those reports. Review the monitoring tool checklist that I talked about before and that we haven't later in the slides, and make sure you're doing your own self-audits to verify that information is good. Do self-assessment. Sign up for the listservs and updates. Join group organizations such as the Interagency Council or the Coalition of Behavioral Health or whatever organization is providing information about your funding streams. Make sure you have a quality assurance department that reviews information on a periodic basis. Consider having an internal audit department or an internal audit assessment in place to make sure that you're following the regulations, that someone is doing some level of testing. We've seen a lot of instances where organizations set up a Medicaid compliance officer, and they have a Medicaid compliance officer in place, but that Medicaid compliance officer is really not doing a formal risk assessment and is not doing formal testing. You really should have some level of testing that's taking place on a regular basis. So what are auditors finding? And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next few slides, but lack of written policies and procedures specifically for purchases, especially in a cost-based environment. They're focusing a lot of time and attention on the purchase function, and they're focusing a lot of time on allocations and allocation methodologies. Missing records. They can't find records. If you can't find a record, they're not going to pay you for the record. Lack of proof of need for services. So does the service that you delivered match out to the script, whether it be an ISP, IFSP, whatever it is? Does it match out to that script that's in place? Do you have the start date? Is it appropriate? Are the services matching out? The dates that you're providing the services, were your staff actually there working? We've seen instances where the dates were wrong that somebody wrote down, and it didn't match out to, it was the individual who signed off on that date was absent that day. So all of the services for that day were disallowed. Even though they just wrote the wrong date, it's still a disallowed service. Missing late evaluations. So if you have to have an evaluation in by a certain time, if it's not there or if it's late, services could be disallowed. We also, in a OPWDD world, we had a situation where there was a Medicaid service coordination program, and they had a supervisor within the Medicaid service coordination program who didn't have the proper education that's required under MSC. So every single case that that supervisor touched was disallowed. It was several $1 million. So again, just make sure you understand the regulations. Charging ineligible expenses, we talked about that. Understand what's allowable and not allowable. Lack of proper documentation or inappropriate allocation methodologies. That's a big one. If you look at most of the state controller's office reports that have been issued, over 85% of them have had an issue with lack of proper documentation. That's probably the biggest issue in the reports that we see, is the lack of proper documentation. Improper time entry recording. We had an instance on an audit where an individual was signing in every morning and then forgot to sign out at night. They were there all day working, but they didn't sign out at night. And their salary for all the days that they did not sign out was disallowed because the state said, how do I know they were there? Exceeding percentage of administrative costs for the grant or contract. Remember, some of the grants and contracts have administrative levels built in. So if you're exceeding those administrative levels, those could be disallowed costs. Drawdown rates are not within contract percentages. Staffing levels not consistent with grant agreement. So again, on the staffing levels, you know, if you have a grant agreement that calls for specific staffing patterns and you have excess staffing, they don't want to pay for inefficiency. You have to be able to substantiate why you have that staff there. Lack of procedures for reporting on following up on critical incidents. So if you don't have proper incident reporting, that could be an issue. Confidential information is not kept secured and protected. That's not so much what we're seeing on the government audits, but that's a big issue on a HIPAA compliance perspective. So remember, I mean, audits can bite. I mean, we've gone through a bunch of audits and they really bite. So give you some examples of some of the audits. And these are just ones that we just happen to go out there and take a look at. So an OASIS funded organization, the report was issued in June of 2016. They found $2.7 million of inappropriately charged depreciation, and they proposed a recoupment. And that was because they were focused on depreciation charged within the drug and alcohol program because OASIS wasn't doing an effective job of monitoring that. So they specifically went looking for depreciation within OASIS-funded agencies. A New York agency in February 2014, almost $662,000 of recoupments, did not follow required purchasing guidelines, not get OASIS pre-approval for required expenditures, provided staff bonuses that were not merit-based, which OASIS regulations are silent to that, but they felt that they should be merit-based, so they disallowed it. Benefits were accrued but not paid. If you're going to accrue a benefit, at some point in time, you got to pay it. Non-allowable costs such as bad debt, underreported program revenue, and they go on. Moving on to OSE Findings, OCFS agencies. December 9th of 2016, there was a disallowance of $493,000, improper allocation of shared space. So if you've got shared space, you have to make sure that you're allocating those shared space appropriately. Lobbying activities, not an allowable cost. Make sure you kind of keep those lobbying. This happens a lot when you belong to a trade association, and some of the dues that you're paying are associated with lobbying, so you kind of have to keep that in mind. Unsupported expenditures, again, didn't have the proper documentation to support the expenditures. Improper vehicle costs, you didn't have the right logs. If anybody has vehicles, there are certain requirements that you have to have in terms of logs. You know, starting mileage, ending mileage, where'd you go, where'd you start from, where'd you go, you know, what was the purpose of the trip, all that stuff has to be in the proper logs. OPWD agency, an organization up in Buffalo in 2014, $2.4 million worth of disallowances, some related party transactions, lack of documentation, non-allowable costs such as staff food, flowers, car allowances, things like that. And now moving to because I've got 3 minutes. I can't read, see that? 2 minutes. OMH funded agencies, again, December 16, disallowance 368, improper allocation of parent costs, lack of support for expenditures, pension costs, non-allowable excess costs, excessive costs for training. They were sending people out of state for training, and they felt that they could get the training here. Another disallowance, 698, management level benefits, where management got benefits that the rest of the staff didn't, and they said that that was not allowable. Staff parties, really? Staff parties? And other unsupported expenses. SED funded agencies, if you really get SED funded, there's a whole bunch of reports out these days on these. These are just 2 of them. Proposed disallowance of $5.8 million in March of 2017. Duplicative management charges, improper charging of salaries, improper bonuses. They were not performance-based. Missing documentation, non-allowable costs, duplicative services. We can go on and on here. January of 17, another one of $242,000. Misallocation of costs, non-allowable costs, unsupported costs, improper vehicle logs. Again, the reason I bring these things up is because there's a lot of information out there, and if you go out and you kind of look at the other agencies that are funded by the same sources you are, again, you can learn a lot from the reports. Just gonna kind of jump ahead. So a couple things to keep in mind: keep lines of communication open with the field office. Make sure you understand what's happening with rules and regulations. Make sure that you're talking to your fiscal and program people at your funding sources, and that you understand and have good relationship with them, because that'll go a long way down the road on an audit. Keep copies of all communication to support responses. So if an auditor asks you for information, you give it to them. Make sure you're keeping track of what you gave them, because if they lose it, they can say, hey, you never gave it to them. So you want to kind of track what you're giving them. Develop formal quality assurance protocols and document work performed. You want audit checklists and documentation. Use the findings, whether they be outside findings or findings within your own quality assurance, as a training mechanism for your staff so that they get better and they learn what they should be doing. Regular reporting should be occurring to your board of directors. There should be communication on a regular basis so your board understands risk. Keep abreast of procedural changes. We talked about that. One of my own kind of pet peeves, I go in and we do a bunch of pre-audits for organizations. And it's amazing where you sit there and you talk to staff and you pull out documentation. You find out that there's a job description, there's a position title code that was charged to a cost report, there's an organizational chart which shows where the person sits on the organizational chart, and there's the interview with the staff, and the four things just don't correspond with each other. I've seen instances where, you know, on the organizational chart, the person is listed as the assistant executive director. On the CFR, they were listed as a curriculum coordinator. When you talk to them, they weren't sure what they did. You know, so you just have to be really careful and make sure that everything kind of matches up, because if it doesn't, that's where problems start to occur. How many of you have formal written allocation methodologies?
As a result of an audit.
If you don't, if you take nothing else from this presentation, put together formal written allocation methodologies and follow those written allocation methodologies. If you change your allocation methodologies, change your written methodology. But you really want to have those formal written allocation methodologies. Because auditors, that's one of the first things they ask for when they come in to do an audit, is they want to know how you're allocating costs, and they want to see your written methodologies. Internal controls and oversight are important. They're extremely important. Stay abreast of funding source audit protocols. Go online and look at, I know I've said it a bunch of times, but I'm going to keep repeating myself. So here's the resources for all of the different funding streams. There's me, there's Shari. Shari was supposed to be here, but she had a personal issue she had to deal with. She talks a lot faster than I do, so you guys are lucky. Any questions on any of this stuff? There's a couple other things I want to deal with in terms of closing. Questions? Questions? Okay, in your folder, there's an evaluation form. Please take the time to fill out the evaluation form. It's very important to us that you fill it out. If there are topics that you want us to talk about in the future, please let us know. If there are things that you want us to do webinars or smaller things on, let us know, because those are things that we're interested in. Also in your packet, there's a little flyer that looks like this. So we have something that we do each year called the Imagine Awards. And a byproduct of the Imagine Awards this year was we have the winners from the May of 17 Imagine Awards are coming together, and they're going to be a panel. And on September 27th, they're going to be here. And you guys have an opportunity to ask questions to the people who won last year's Imagine Awards. These are some of the top nonprofit organizations on Long Island. So take the opportunity to come here and ask them questions and find out, you know, hit them up with the really tough questions like how do you get your board motivated to do things, and, you know, all those other things. So questions, comments, anything else? All right, so I want to thank everybody for coming. We appreciate it. You guys kind of make today special, because without you, I'd be talking to an empty room.